Now we are actually going to be looking at the proofs that's dealing with everything put together. So we need to prove triangles congruent and then somehow use CP/CTC to make our statement true. So let's look at number 6. It says given UP is congruent to OP and TS is congruent to RS and angle UPT, which is right there, is congruent to QPR right there. And TSP, this right angle, is congruent to RSP, the other right angle. So we have a lot of given statements. So now let's focus on what are we actually trying to prove. We are actually trying to prove PTU, this triangle, is congruent to PRQ, which is this triangle. So if we just focus on those for a second, you will notice that we have an angle, a side. So we either need this angle congruent or we need this side congruent for side angle side. So I'm looking at this angle here first, and I don't think there would be a good way to get there. But I am looking at this side right here. If we could prove this side and this side's congruent, then we could do it. So now I'm going to move inside. Can I prove this triangle congruent to this triangle? If I can do that, then I can say the sides are congruent and then move to the outside. So let's see how if we can write this up. So what we're first going to look at are the green triangles. So we're going to do step 2 here. To speed this up, I've already got the given typed in. If I look at the green triangles, I see a reflexive piece in the middle. So I can say segment PS is congruent to segment PS, and that is going to be the reflexive property of congruence. Once I see that that is reflexive, I will now notice that I have a side, a congruent angle, and another side. So step 3 can be triangle SPT is congruent to triangle SPR, and we are going to use side, angle, side. Now, the whole purpose of doing that is to prove that the outside triangles are now congruent. So now that we have the inside triangles congruent, this is now what we can do. So this side and this side now by CP/CTC are now congruent. So step 4 can be segment PT is congruent to segment PR. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So now if I mark that, I now have a side angle side right there. So step 5 can be the end of it. It is triangle PTU is congruent to triangle PRQ, step 5, side, angle, side. So we are now going to be dealing with a little bit more detailed figures, but they're not always going to be such complicated steps. So this one we were able to do in 5 steps. Now let's look at number 7. The first thing I want you to notice is that this is an overlapping triangle. You are given angle A is congruent to angle C, and angle AED is congruent to CDE. Now, I have told you in other lessons, the best thing that you can do sometimes is to separate the figure. So if I separate the figure and I label this A, E, D, and this one is C, D, E, I might can see some other things. So before we do that, let's look and see what we are trying to prove. We are trying to prove this segment AD is congruent to this segment CE. If I can prove the triangle's congruent, then I can say those parts are congruent. So now, let's go to this. I was given A is congruent to C, AED is congruent to CDE. So I have an angle. So if I had a side, that would be wonderful. And if you look here at the bottom of the triangle, that is a reflexive side. So I can actually mark that side, and now I have an angle, and a side. So my step 2 can be segment ED is congruent to segment DE, reflexive property of congruence. Now I have angle, side. So triangle AED is congruent to triangle CDE, angle, side. So the triangles are congruent, therefore the parts are congruent. So segment AD is congruent to segment CE. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So again, anytime you have overlapping figures, separate so you can see relationships. Moving on to number 8. This one is given BD is congruent, or actually perpendicular, to AC, and AB is congruent to CB. Now, if you'll notice the perpendicular, that's a big step, so that's in an indirect way telling us we have a right angle, which leads to a right triangle. Now, if we can come up with a way to do the proof to get the triangles, then we would be in good shape. So I'm going to go with the perpendicular, that I know that would be a right angle. If I look across, I notice that is a hypotenuse. I have a reflexive leg here, so I'm going to approach this one with hypotenuse leg. So, step 1, given. Step 2, we must state what we're dealing with. So we have to state what perpendicular means. So we need to state angle ADB and angle CDB, sorry about that, CBD are right angles. Step 2, definition of perpendicular lines. Step 3, now we say triangle ADB and triangle CBD are right triangles. Now we have to state that in order to use hypotenuse leg. So this is going to be definition of a right triangle. Now we've already noted in the figure here that is a leg and that is a reflexive piece. So we're going to say BD is congruent to BD. Again, reflexive property of congruence. Step 5, triangle ABD is congruent to triangle CBD, hypotenuse leg. And now we have congruent triangles. If we have congruent triangles, we have congruent parts. So A and C are going to be congruent by CPCTC. So step 6, angle 6 is congruent to angle C. Congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now, the last problem, I encourage you to pause this video and read it and try to see if you can start this one by yourself. Now that you've looked at it, you can see that it's asking us to prove that JKL is isosceles. So what are they really asking us to do? They're really asking us to prove these two legs are congruent. So they gave us a lot of information. They did give us angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and they also gave us that 3 is congruent to 4. So I like that because the first thing I can see is that I can prove the two small triangles are congruent. I have an angle I have an angle, and if I could prove this congruent, I would have angle side angle. Well, you've guessed it, KM is also reflexive. So step 2, KM is congruent to segment KM. If you notice, we have used reflexive in every proof on the back side of our notes. So reflexive property of congruence. Now we have that, we now have angle side angle. So triangle JKM is congruent to triangle LKM, angle side angle. Now, since we have congruent triangles, we have congruent parts. So JK, the segment JK, is congruent to segment LK, and we know that by corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And then this time, it doesn't matter. It just asks us to prove that it's isosceles. Well, if we know these are congruent, then we know it's isosceles because definition of isosceles. So we can simply say triangle JKL is isosceles, definition of isosceles. So this lesson basically takes everything we have studied about triangles and corresponding parts of congruent triangles and puts it together.